Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. Let's get right to it. This chat was described as explorers living the American dream in the Far East. But I believe you are living the Animoca dream in the Far East. What is the mindset and the outlook that you're seeing right now and experiencing in Asia when it comes to crypto and Web3 compared to other regions in the world, especially here in the West?
I mean, I think particularly not so much the West as it is in the Americas, shall we say, specifically US and Canada, more US. There has been more of a negative connotation when it comes to crypto, NFT, and Web3. But the reason why is because there's a strong correlation between Web3 and capitalism. And if you look at what happened in the US over the last 20, 30 years, capitalism hasn't worked, especially for young Americans. So there's a natural sentiment. It's anti-Wall Street, it's anti-billionaires, it's anti-money, generally speaking, which also explains the whole of political landscape that we see in the US, particularly between the Democratic and the Republican Party, for example. Now you go to Asia, for instance, in the last 30 to 40 years, capitalism has worked very well for Asia. Yes, there is inequity. There is, of course, some disparity of wealth. But in living memory, capitalism, property rights, and the idea that you basically have a better future has worked out. Look at China, for instance. Over the last 40 years, close to 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty because you have a form of property rights and you have effectively a kind of capitalism. Look at South Korea, an economy that was smaller than that of North Korea 30, 40 years ago, and today is the 12th or 13th largest GDP in the world. Why? Intellectual property, respect of property rights, and the capitalist and democratic framework. So this type of stuff is actually what's now possible in Web3, right? Meaning you have the idea of digital property rights and effectively digital capitalism in the form of crypto in the Web3 world. But if you're already sort of negatively skewed towards that, then what you see is digital capitalism and all the problems. And it's not helpful, unfortunately, for some of our fellow members in the community when they go out and they talk about this joke about when Lambo. That's not good, right? Because people out there, it's very tone deaf when people see that and they say, oh, is that what it's all about? Of course it's not what it's all about. That's like saying the car industry is only about Lamborghinis. Of course it's not. But unfortunately, that's what people see when they don't understand that. So I think there's some work to do on the narrative. But that's why Asia is so excited, because Asia has seen the benefits of property rights, and they see digital property rights as that next wave, which is why they're adopting Web3 so aggressively.
I was stalking your Twitter yesterday, and you tweeted, quote, Asia is welcoming Web3, crypto, and the blockchain community, and specifically mentioned Hong Kong and Tokyo as places to watch.
Yes.
Not there yet. What are the differences in the perceptions and attitudes, and why is it being embraced in those cities?
Well, so first of all, over the last 9 months to a year, Hong Kong has fully embraced Web3. I would argue that actually digital assets and Web3 in Hong Kong has the potential to actually become a global leader in that space. Why? Well, first of all, they have a progressive policy. Just as of June, they basically announced retail trading. They've given out, I think, over 10 licenses now for exchanges, for instance. They have crypto ETFs already since last year. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which is essentially like, one of the regulators, came out with a tokenized green bond, right? When we opened up sort of this event, the financial secretary basically came on stage sort of at a different event together with me wearing an NFT sort of outfit together with me. So it was just sort of really demonstrating how forward they are in the space. But why are they so forward on this one is because they understand the value of sort of Web3, digital property rights, and capitalism and what it does. Hong Kong has routinely been named one of the either number 1 or number 2 freest economy in the world. So the values are very aligned with it. So that's the first point. But the second thing, I think, what some people haven't noticed is that when Hong Kong came out and announced basically retail support for crypto, for instance, announcing a set of 15 tokens that could be traded, China actually broadcasted on national TV that you can buy Bitcoin in Hong Kong. I mean, this is something, again, that most people may not actually realize, that actually China is not saying you can do it in China, but you can look at doing it in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's role has always been to be the conduit, basically, of this type of sort of, let's call it, overseas investing or financial services for China, going in and out. And also China, Beijing specifically, came out with a Web3 strategy paper. So you can see that these things are happening in tandem. So you could call it a happy coincidence, but I think for some people they might say, well, maybe there is some event of sort of, coordination. And Japan is the same. So Japan is pushing forward in that direction as well. They recently changed the tax laws. In fact, Japan is probably one of the only countries in the world where you can have a legal IEO approved by the JFSA, which is the equivalent of the SEC in Japan, for instance. And most people don't know that. So they've been very progressive on this one because they have a very strong artist community because of their anime and manga culture. So they really see the benefits of non-fungible tokens, digital property rights, and generally the protection of the intellectual property rights. And I would sort of close with a general statement, not just about Hong Kong and Japan, but just the region as well as Middle East and Europe. Even MICA has come out with more progressive rules around sort of crypto regulation, you could say. It's because it has a lot to do with wanting to have independence from American technology as well. So it's not just about self-sovereign identity, that's a part of it, but it's also about sovereign national identity because all of these countries are dependent on US technologies. They have to use Facebook, they have to use Microsoft, they have to use Apple. You know, if someone, you know, in America gets to decide that an app in Hong Kong or in Japan can actually get launched, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. So there has to be a way to break that up, and that's basically why so many national interests are also in sort of supporting Web3. So there's definitely a narrative that is pushing that forward in places like Asia and the rest of the world, outside of the US.
A lot of people love to ask you about crypto, and right after that FTX collapse, got to address the FTX collapse. But I want to get your current assessment on where that stands. And when we wrap that up, I got to ask you about ApeCoin.
Sure. Well, first, I mean, last year was one heck of a year, but the way I see it is that after having survived Terra, Three Arrows, FTX, a war, right? Inflation, all interest rates, everything put together. And here we are, Bitcoin's floating around 30,000, for instance, right? Ethereum is around, I don't know, 17, 1800, 1900, whatever that range is. There's still liquidity in the market. The market continues to grow. So to me, it's just a test of the strength of that resilience that the industry has. Whatever you throw at it, typically other industries would have already collapsed by now, but you can see the resilience that is native within basically the digital assets industry. So, I'm bullish about that. But where are we today? Well, I mean, even when you look at the whole state of the market, actually, the market cap combined is about $1.2 trillion, for instance. The number of wallets are continuing to increase. The number of smart contracts, which is essentially a way to measure the operations that are there, continues to grow. So macro, the numbers actually look very positive. I would say that there is a narrative, particularly in America, that has been quite negative. But also there's been a narrative around trying to segregate between this whole thing about, AI is a new thing to look at, and Web3 and crypto isn't. But the two are actually very natively tied. Because our view is that AI is actually going to power Web3 and crypto in a much more massive way, because at the end of the day, whether it's NPC characters or whether it's autonomous AI agents, they're going to transact, they're going to do business. How are they going to do business? They're going to be doing business in crypto, because crypto is the digitally native currency that is designed for a digital native sort of service or technology, which is AI. So we think those things tie in very naturally together. And also how we protect our digital rights, from AI comes from owning the stuff that we have on chain. And that basically is only possible through blockchain.
You invest in a lot of AI startups, and you just touched on it there, how this is all integrated. But if you could broadly more explain AI impact on Web3.
Well, so I just talked briefly around the transactional nature of AI, right? Which I think is crypto was made essentially for AI in that sense. But there's also the other thing around protecting our rights. Right now, all of our data sets are currently in centralized systems, but on blockchain, they end up becoming basically in public blockchains which you can audit and account for. The AI is going to pick that data and is able to then compensate you for that. On one hand, you could say, generative AI could be a threat for artists. On the other hand, it could be an opportunity. Because if you're able to calculate that this particular art was inspired or utilized your artwork, then you might be entitled to a share in that ownership because it can track that in sort of an incredible way that you can't do in another way. So I think there's some examples here where sort of AI and Web3 are very complementary.
You talk a lot about, you've mentioned property and ownership, and there's a governance part of this, and learning about this is also very important. I want you to talk to us about your company making this really big commitment recently to Open Campus.
Sure.
And specifically its Global Educators Fund. Why are you so passionate about this?
Well, maybe before we even go there, let me just cover a little bit about ApeCoin, since we forgot to talk about that a bit, because it's kind of related, because they're both DAOs. So DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations. These decentralized autonomous organizations are essentially community-run. They're not run by a central organization. They're not run necessarily by professional VCs or central companies. The community, who either owns tokens or owns NFTs, have a way to basically direct what happens in them. And the numbers are pretty big. The total number of the value that sits inside these treasuries of these DAOs today numbers over $12 billion. which means that also it sort of puts upside down the idea of how you raise money. That's more money than most VCs have put together, for instance, right? So you can go to something like ApeCoin, which is $1 billion DAO, in which I just recently sort of stepped down, and these members were elected by the community, where you can basically get money from them to build something for the ecosystem or to build something in the Web3 culture space, for instance. And the other thing is that the members who are running this DAO are all elected by the community, who never really had a chance to be in those positions of, you could say, power. For instance, if you want to be a director in a listed company somewhere, you have to maybe go to Harvard, or you have this qualification, or you have all this type of stuff that, is reasonable perhaps. But, what doesn't sometimes make sense is that it's not necessarily true that you have to have these qualifications to be a director. A DAO basically democratizes this access because it's a community that wants to elect it in that. And I think, to me, DAOs are the organizations of the future. We think DAOs are going to be bigger than companies, and therefore will have sizes of economies that actually become like nation states. For instance, why shouldn't a company of a listed company, whether it's Nike or Facebook or Amazon, have a representative of its board be a representative of its customers? This doesn't happen. There is not a customer representative on the Amazon board or the Facebook board or the Nike board. It's other people who are very qualified, but they're maybe somewhat out of touch with their consumers. They don't represent their voice. That's one of the opportunities that DAOs can represent. So really excited about that. And of course, it's somewhat threatening to existing institutions because it is not just about decentralizing ecosystems, it's about decentralizing organizational structures, giving power to essentially a broader base. To now talk about Open Campus, Open Campus is exactly the same thing, but for educators and teachers. It's like a $700–800 million DAO. We recently launched a $10 million fund, which is governed by the token holders who are educators and teachers in the space. That means now teachers can decide what gets funded by other teachers. Now, that doesn't seem like a crazy idea because teachers are fairly responsible and they'll want to see progress in the products that they're developing. But the classic sense is, teachers aren't financially literate, they don't have background, so we should give the money part to the financial professional to decide what should get funded. But that doesn't seem to hold water because that person may not know anything about what the education space needs. They were just recently at ISTE, so I came from Philadelphia for that. They put up this wishing tree, and in this wishing tree, teachers who would apply for the grant were able to write down what they wanted to get their funding for, and the tree was filled up with wishes from all these teachers about things they wanted for. And by the way, it's not a lot of money. It's like, I want $2,000 for this, $5,000 for this, $3,000 for this. It's not that much. And then each of these products that they're developing turn into NFTs. And these NFTs then become assets because they themselves can generate yield. That means that something that a teacher made can now be sold to another person and basically create what we see in property rights, in the form of real estate or other kind of assets, but now in the form of content. And education is a $5 trillion space. It's bigger even than gaming. But it's controlled by a very small group of people, and the ones who create all that education, the biggest content creators, which are teachers, actually get almost nothing for it. So again, this is an example of how Web3 not just creates more equity in the framework, but also aligns incentives between the right parties.
What kind of mindset are you seeing in Web3 innovators and the young entrepreneurs hoping to make their way into this space? And what do they need to have to move forward?
So I think, the right type of Web3 builder has to be someone who thinks about essentially aligning incentives in as equitable a space as possible. Now, I don't mean this in a socialist sense. It has to be capitalist. We think of Web3 and blockchain almost like a political system. It brings forward essentially a capitalist framework, but it changes some things. One of the problems we have in the world today is a very unequal capitalist framework because of shareholder capitalism. Wealth is concentrated by a very small percentage of the world. Most of the people are essentially serving the platforms, giving them value, and not getting anything in return. But in Web3, you become a stakeholder. Whether you own a token, whether you own an NFT, whether you own land and sandbox, whether you own a Bored Ape, you become a member of that community, which means you then have a vote. You have a say in that sort of ecosystem as a result of owning a stake in that, which means you participate in its growth. And imagine as a mental model, if every time we shared something on Instagram, we would actually receive a small stake in Instagram for its value. It could be very minuscule. And if I offered more value to Instagram, I would receive more of a stake. The value share and the incentive structure would be completely different. It's like giving every Uber driver a small share in Uber, for instance, or someone who contributes to the network a benefit of that network. This is how we think Web3 can really save the capitalist narrative because it introduces essentially stakeholder capitalism into the ecosystem. And that's something that's not well understood because financial literacy, broadly speaking, isn't well understood. And that's the other thing that we see the opportunity with Web3, is that if you bring and introduce Web3 broadly to the world, you're actually enhancing financial literacy, which then means that we can do away with things like high credit card debt or no knowledge about how to invest. Because we can teach our children about algebra, and we can teach our children about sort of all sorts of math and sort of esoteric derivatives, but we can't teach them about economics and money in primary school. That, to me, has always been a puzzle, and I think we need to fix that.
And you think that more young people should be versed in this and learn about it. Are you
Absolutely.
Seeing the growth? Are you seeing the numbers?
Yes. So one of the challenges that you see in Web3, the challenge we think isn't so much a UX challenge in terms of opening a wallet or so on. That's actually quite easy to do. What the challenge is around understanding financial literacy. But the value is there, because just like in the physical world, property rights, if you have a country that has property rights, for instance, the value is amplified 30, 40 times because you have capital formation. The examples are clear. A place like Canada or the US that has property rights has economies and GDPs far larger than North Korea, which technically has natural resources, has perhaps a big population, but has zero economic activity because it doesn't have any property rights. So we see the same kind of effect. But people have to understand that principle. And because we don't teach people about money, they don't actually understand what they can do there. And that's why we're excited about blockchain gaming, because actually, this is where most of our young people are engaged in. They play games, they learn, you learn through play. But play used to be in the physical space, but play today is in a digital space, which means that the kind of games you play can't just be limited towards the extractive form of fun and entertainment. They have a duty to educate. They have a duty to sort of train people for the world as well. And that means we have to teach them through these mediums around value and money. We've seen this example in the early days with, for instance, Axie Infinity. You look at Philippines. Over millions of people in the Philippines opened a crypto wallet and became financially included, because you can't open a bank account in these places for a salary of $10 a month. They didn't have to they didn't have a financial education, they don't have a university degree, and yet they learned how to use a wallet, they learned how to trade on it, and they learned basically how to make a living in a Web3 environment. So it shows that it's within our capacity to do so. We just have to give them that opportunity.
Last thoughts. We have about 30 seconds or so left. What excites you? We've seen so much rapid change we've been talking about, but what do you project in the next 2 years, 5 years, what this space will look like?
Well, I think gaming will continue to drive, adoption. What people don't see is that wallet numbers are actually coming mostly from the gaming side. But because of this lack of financial literacy, they're not converting directly into financial activities, but they're playing these games. Many of the games that have been developed over the last 2 years or 3 years are now just about to come out. So we think mass onboarding will happen. There's some stats to know. Last year, NFT sales was $24 billion, not a small number. But the important thing to understand is that $24 billion, 90% of the value went to creators and owners of these NFTs. In contrast, Spotify paid out $7 billion of royalties in that same year, even though it serves hundreds of millions of users. So that gives you an example of the size of that, scale of that opportunity. But the NFT community is literally only in the million plus, versus the Spotify or music community is much, much larger. So what happens when you start onboarding, even just 100 million people into the Web3 community? Those ecosystems will not blow into billions of dollars. They'll grow into trillions of dollars, creating these huge national metaverse economies that we believe will basically change the world.
Yat Siu, Animoca Brands, your passion and excitement is contagious. Thank you so much for this discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you.